In the final hours of August 31st, 1939, the border was quiet. Too quiet. Along the frontier between Germany and Poland, military units waited in darkness. Engines were kept warm. Orders had already been distributed, but the attack had not yet begun. Inside command posts, officers checked their watches. Everything depended on timing. Rail movements had been calculated to the minute. Air squadrons were on standby. Armored columns stood ready behind the line. For weeks, preparations had accelerated in secret. Now there was nothing left to plan, only to wait. Across the Polish frontier, the atmosphere was tense but uncertain. Reports of German mobilization had reached Warsaw. Border units had been reinforced. Defensive positions prepared, but the scale of what was coming remained unclear. Through the night, reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously. Telephones rang inside headquarters. Telegrams arrived and were quickly decoded. Messengers moved between units under strict silence. In Berlin, the final authorization had already been given. There would be no delay. The operation was set for dawn. Along the border roads, long columns of vehicles stood motionless in the dark. Crews sat quietly inside their machines. Infantry waited beside transport trucks. Pilots reviewed target maps one last time. The war had not yet begun, but it was only hours away. At 4:45 a.m., the silence would end. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the waiting ended. German forces crossed the Polish frontier. Operation Fall Weiss, Case White, was underway. The attack did not begin with a single thrust. It began everywhere at once. From East Prussia in the north, from Silesia in the south, and from the German heartland in the west. Multiple army groups moved forward simultaneously. The objective was speed and disorientation. Polish defenses would be struck from several directions before a coordinated response could form. In the opening minutes, artillery units fired pre-planned barrages along key positions. Forward reconnaissance units pushed across border crossings. Armored spearheads followed closely behind. Communications hubs were targeted early. Rail junctions, bridges, command centers. The intention was clear: break the defensive structure before it could stabilize. German planners had spent months refining the timetable. Units moved according to tightly synchronized schedules. Air support was already in motion. Ground forces advanced under covering operations. Along hundreds of kilometers of frontier, the same pattern repeated. The invasion of Poland had begun, and with it, the Second World War had entered its first hours. At dawn, the silence shattered. German forces opened the war with coordinated strikes across Poland. Artillery thundered along the frontier. Pre-planned bombardments targeted defensive positions, communication nodes, and transport routes. The objective was shock. Before Polish commanders could fully assess the situation, the battlefield was already in motion. Moments later, aircraft appeared overhead. Low-flying bombers moved toward rail yards and airfields. Sirens echoed across towns, still waking to morning light. Explosions followed in quick succession. Bridges were hit. Rail lines disrupted. Forward positions shaken. Speed and confusion were essential to the opening phase. German planners intended to fracture Poland's ability to coordinate. Telephone lines were cut. Command posts came under pressure. Local units struggled to understand the scale of the assault. Along hundreds of kilometers, the same pattern unfolded. Bombardment, advance, disruption. For many civilians, the first awareness of war came not from official announcements, but from the sound of aircraft engines and distant detonations. Within hours, the conflict had moved beyond border skirmishes. Europe was witnessing the opening blows of a new war. The opening strikes were only the beginning. Now came the doctrine that would define the early war: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. German strategy focused on speed and concentration of force. Instead of slow, grinding advances, armored units punched through weak points in the defensive line. Once a gap opened, mechanized columns drove deep into the rear. The objective was not merely to push the enemy back, it was to break cohesion. Tanks moved fast across open terrain. Motorized infantry followed closely behind. Aircraft provided continuous support from above. Communication was constant. Radio-equipped units coordinated movements in real time, a major advantage over more rigid command structures. Polish defensive lines, designed for more traditional warfare, struggled to adapt to the tempo. Positions that held in the morning were bypassed by afternoon. Units that expected frontal assault suddenly found enemy forces behind them. Encirclement became the key tactic. German columns did not always stop to destroy resistance immediately. They moved past it. Isolated pockets would be dealt with later. Momentum was everything. The speed of the advance created confusion at every level of the Polish command structure. Reports became outdated within hours. Front lines shifted faster than orders could travel. By the end of the first days, the character of the campaign was clear. This was not a slow war of attrition. It was a war of movement, and it had only just begun. The scale of the attack became clear quickly, but Poland did not collapse without resistance. Along the frontier, Polish units moved to their defensive positions as reports of the German advance arrived. Field commanders attempted to stabilize the line. Infantry units dug in. Artillery batteries returned fire. Mobile reserves were ordered forward. But the situation was already fluid. German armored spearheads were moving faster than expected. In many sectors, Polish forces found themselves reacting to breakthroughs rather than preventing them. Communication became a critical challenge. Telephone lines had been damaged. Radio coordination was limited. Orders sometimes arrived too late to match the rapidly changing battlefield. Despite these obstacles, local resistance was determined. Defensive strongpoints held for hours, sometimes longer. Small units fought delaying actions along roads and river crossings. Rail movements attempted to reposition reserves toward threatened sectors. Polish pilots scrambled to intercept incoming air attacks. On the ground, the tempo of the German advance forced difficult decisions. Hold and risk encirclement, or withdraw and preserve forces. In the opening phase, many units chose to stand and fight. The result was a patchwork battlefield. Some positions remained intact. Others were already being bypassed. The invasion was only days old, but the pressure was already immense. From the first hours of the invasion, control of the sky became critical. German planners understood that air superiority would accelerate the ground campaign. The Luftwaffe moved quickly. Airfields were struck early, runways targeted, aircraft caught on the ground where possible. The objective was disruption. If Polish air units could not coordinate effectively, ground forces would operate with far greater freedom. But the Polish Air Force was not destroyed in a single blow. Pilots scrambled from dispersed airstrips. Fighter units rose to intercept incoming formations. Dogfights broke out above rail lines, towns, and open countryside. The engagements were fast and chaotic. German aircraft generally operated with numerical advantage and tighter radio coordination. Polish pilots relied heavily on skill, improvisation, and local initiative. In the opening days, air combat remained intense in several sectors. Bombers pressed their missions against infrastructure targets. Fighter escorts attempted to maintain protective screens. Below, ground forces watched the sky constantly. Air power was reshaping the battlefield in real time. Supply routes became vulnerable. Defensive movements were exposed. Command centers faced increasing pressure. By the end of the first phase, the balance in the air was beginning to tilt. And on the modern battlefield, control of the air meant control of momentum. For civilians, the war arrived without warning. In towns across Poland, the morning began like any other. Shops opened, trains prepared to depart, families started their daily routines. Then the sirens sounded. Aircraft engines echoed overhead. Within minutes, normal life began to fracture. Rail stations filled with confusion. Crowds gathered in streets, looking toward the sky. Rumors spread faster than confirmed reports. In many areas, evacuation plans were incomplete or improvised. Families packed what they could carry. Some fled toward the countryside, others crowded into basements and improvised shelters. Roads quickly became congested. Horse carts, civilian cars, and military vehicles competed for the same narrow routes. Communication breakdown made the situation worse. Official announcements lagged behind events on the ground. In some towns, residents did not fully understand what was happening until explosions were already nearby. The psychological shock was immediate. The speed of the German advance created a sense of disorientation. Front lines were unclear, safe zones uncertain. What had been distant political tension was now personal reality. The war was no longer at the border. It was in the streets. News of the invasion spread quickly across Europe. In London and Paris, the crisis that leaders had long feared was now unfolding in real time. Both Britain and France had pledged to defend Poland. Now they faced a decision that could not be delayed. Emergency meetings were convened. Cabinet members gathered around maps and intelligence reports. Military staffs reviewed mobilization plans that had been prepared but never fully tested. Publicly, diplomatic channels remained open. Briefly, ultimatums were drafted. Messages were sent to Berlin demanding withdrawal. But the German advance did not slow. In Britain, the government prepared the nation for the possibility of war. Civil defense measures were activated. Naval forces moved to operational readiness. Air defenses were placed on alert. France followed a similar path. Partial mobilization expanded. Frontier defenses were reinforced. Strategic planning accelerated along the western border. Time was running out. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. France followed shortly after. The conflict that had begun on the Polish frontier was now widening. Yet, on the ground in Poland, immediate relief did not come. The declarations marked a turning point. Europe was no longer facing a regional crisis. It was entering a general war. As German forces drove deeper into Poland, attention remained fixed on the Western Front. But in the east, another development was quietly unfolding. The Soviet Union was watching closely. Under the terms of the secret agreement, Moscow had its own timetable. For now, Soviet forces did not intervene. Instead, preparations intensified behind the eastern frontier. Troop concentrations increased, rail movements expanded, logistical corridors were quietly organized, public statements remained cautious. Official language emphasized neutrality and observation, but the military posture told a different story. Polish commanders were aware of the risk. Intelligence reports suggested growing Soviet activity along the border. Yet, with German forces already pressing hard from the west, Poland's strategic options were limited. Resources were stretched, reserves were committed. Attention remained focused on the immediate threat. In Moscow, timing was everything. The moment to move had to be calculated carefully. Too early, and it risked diplomatic complications. Too late, and Germany might secure more territory than agreed. So the Soviet Union waited. Prepared. Watching. Positioned for the next phase of the campaign. By early September 1939, the conflict had crossed a threshold. What began as an invasion was becoming a continental war. Germany's rapid advance into Poland had shattered the fragile balance of Europe. Britain and France had now entered the conflict. Mobilization orders spread across the continent. Armies prepared for a war few believed could remain limited. Railways filled with troop movements. Factories accelerated production. Civil defense systems activated in major cities. The political crisis of the 1930s had finally become open war. Yet in the first days, the full scale of what lay ahead was still difficult to grasp. Many leaders believed the conflict might still be contained. History would prove otherwise. The invasion of Poland marked the opening chapter of a global struggle that would reshape borders, governments, and millions of lives. The speed of the German offensive demonstrated a new form of warfare. The diplomatic system that had governed Europe since the end of the First World War was collapsing. Alliances hardened. Neutral states grew uneasy. Military planners across Europe began preparing for a long conflict. September 1939 was not merely the start of another war. It was the beginning of a total war that would engulf continents. The guns that opened fire along the Polish frontier had set something much larger in motion, and the world would not return to the old order.